Sony has announced their next generation specs for the PlayStation, but what did they actually announce? What's up everybody, Brad here back again, and earlier this week, Sony announced their next generation specs. We've got the Zen 2, which is based on AMD Ryzen. It's going to be a 7nm microarchitecture. The graphics are from the Navi family, which is no surprise there. They've got 3D audio, a fancy-dancy solid-state drive, and we don't know the RAM. So what did Sony actually announce this week? Well, honestly, not a whole lot, because we're missing a lot of information. For one thing, we don't know the clock speed. We don't know the clock speed of either the CPU or the GPU, which is going to play a major role in actually determining performance. We also don't know the cooling situation, because if you think about it, liquid cooling has become pretty popular among enthusiast communities, and it's become a lot easier. It wouldn't be crazy to hear that a company is going to liquid cool their stuff, or liquid cool their console, to get better performance out of it and better thermals. Microsoft has explored this with like phones and servers and all that stuff, so it wouldn't be surprising to see either one of these companies go down that route to get the best possible performance. Interestingly enough, Sony announced all this information the same day Microsoft launched their Xbox One S without a disk drive, potentially trying to grab some of those headlines away from the Xbox family. And the reason why this is just kind of awkward or weird is, yes, it's good to have all this information finally documented and confirmed, but at the same time, we don't really know anything. We don't know the performance specs, right? We don't know the RAM. And those are major things, right? T-flops is everything when it comes to console, because that's the raw output of power that these things are going to be able to calculate. And Sony's not going to talk about that stuff. The other odd thing too is that Sony gave Microsoft a very long runway before E3. There's roughly 2 months between now and when Microsoft is going to talk about their next gen consoles. We already know that Sony is not going to E3, and I guarantee they're probably going to have some announcement around then to try to quell off, again, some of the Xbox stuff. But what they've done is they've handed Microsoft and said, hey, here's most of our specs. Let's see what you got. And now Microsoft has the opportunity and the chance to craft their marketing pitch around what Sony has announced. If Microsoft has more cores and all that stuff becomes super easy, and I can guarantee in the Redmond camp, Redmond, Washington, which is where Microsoft is based, Phil Spencer's either dancing or he's really concerned. Although I do expect that Anaconda is going to be very comparable to what Sony is offering. You got to remember that both of these companies are effectively using off-the-shelf components for most of their stuff. They walked into AMD's office and says, hey, what's your next gen processor? And they said, hey, it's going to be 7nm Zen 2. And they said, what's your next gen graphics? Oh, it's going to be Navi. So both companies had a similar parts bin to pick from. Remember, neither company is going all in like Sony did with the PlayStation 3 with custom architecture and all that good stuff. So what it's going to come down to are more than likely software, clock speed. RAM is going to play a big part. RAM is very crucial in a gaming experience. Sony is talking up big games about their solid state storage, which will be interesting when somebody can actually clock it and see how it is actually faster or what they're doing. We know that Microsoft is likely using NVMe. At least that is what is in some of the dev kits currently. So we'll be curious to see what Sony does. But what they announced yesterday was not a whole lot, honestly. These are all things that we expected. And candidly, these are things I expect from the Microsoft camp. Granted, we don't know the cores and all that stuff, but I do believe that Microsoft is gunning to have the most powerful console next generation with Anaconda. They're not too worried about pricing. Granted, they're not going to go crazy, but they also are going to have the Lockhart console, which is going to be the less expensive model, right? And so Microsoft is willing to, I think, take a bigger risk on Anaconda to guarantee that they get that performance win. And I think that, well, they now know what Sony is doing. Like if Microsoft comes in with more cores, granted, we also don't know the threads of the processor, right? Depending on what you get, they could have just 8 threads, which that seems a little underpowered. I bet they have 16 threads. That would seem more logical right now, but we will find out. So kind of like the hangover of what did Sony announce? The problem is they announced a bunch of stuff, but candidly, they didn't really announce anything. They announced what I like to call soft specs because they are just the specs, but they don't tell us anything, right? It's like buying a car and it says, hey, it's got some cylinders in there and it's got some wheels, but how fast does it go? What's the miles per gallon? We don't know any of this information when it comes to what Sony announced. So it was a very calculated and slow drip of information. And they know that they put out just enough information to grab headlines, but not enough to actually really tell us anything about the performance characteristics of their next gen console, other than it loads a current gen game a lot faster thanks to the solid state drive. but that's not a big deal. We all know that if you swap out spinning rust and put a solid state drive in there, you're going to get better performance. That's a no-brainer. So, what's the takeaway from this is it was an interesting announcement. Microsoft now has a lot of time to line up their E3. I'm still hearing that Anaconda is more than likely more powerful than the next generation Sony console, but does that mean anything if it's just a little bit more? It would have to be a massive generational leap in performance to actually make any difference. It's all going to come down to software and services. We still don't know the RAM. We still don't know a lot of things. So while Sony did give us a little bit of bait and they played the media well, they didn't actually announce much of anything. And so the next big event is going to be E3, where I fully expect Microsoft to talk more, but they might do the same thing. I can't imagine either of these companies talking a lot about T-flops yet. Microsoft might make a performance guesstimation about where they're going to go. But you got to remember, we are more than a year away from this stuff, which means they've got a lot of time to optimize software. Yields of the processor have to be brought up to speed and everything else. And there's a lot of, just because you have the chip doesn't mean you actually know the performance either, right? There's a lot of factors that go into it and a lot of tweaking that's going to happen right up until the console launches. So with that being said, Sony announced a lot of stuff, but at the same time, they really didn't announce anything.